Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're cracking open a really fascinating piece of history. It's a once top-secret Japanese military document, Anatomy of the Heart, or officially, the Intelligence Propaganda Service Guidelines.
Right, that's loose.
Exactly. This was the playbook used by, well, the Imperial Japanese Army's General Staff HQ, 2nd Department, Army attachés, the famous Nakano School. Basically their guide for intel and propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't just, tactics. It was foundational stuff.
Yeah.
How they thought about getting information, shaping how people saw things. A rare look into that mindset.
Compiled way back in February 1928.
And it's kind of amazing it survived the war, It was actually republished in March 1956.
Really? Decades later.
Yeah, which tells you something, right? They must have thought the core principles about information, about influence, were still pretty relevant, even with all the changes.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our goal today, for you listening, is to really dig into these core ideas. What can we learn about their approach to intelligence, to propaganda back then?
It's a direct line, really.
Yeah. And the document, it's split into two main sections.
That's right. Two key parts. First, Intelligence Service CA, and second, Propaganda and Stratagem Service.
Let's start with the intelligence service stuff.
All right, diving in. That first section, intelligence service. It kicks off with a pretty strong statement about information, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Right off the bat, the core principle. Intelligence about your enemy is the basis for everything. All concepts, all actions, peace or war.
So in peacetime, it's about being prepared.
Exactly. Military readiness. And then in wartime, it's how you direct the war, how you run operations. Everything hinges on knowing what the other side is up to. Informed action is key.
It then makes some distinctions, different ways of getting info. Can you break those down? Sure. It talks about information service, search service, and intelligence service. Information service is kind of the umbrella term collecting, checking, judging, spreading info about the enemy. All that work.
Okay.
Search service is more direct, using military force, reconnaissance, that sort of thing.
Right.
But intelligence service, which is the focus here, that's gathering info without using military force. Overt ways, covert ways.
So using spies, attachés, open sources.
Exactly. And you see this careful breakdown. It shows they were thinking strategically about every possible angle to get information. Different methods, different kinds of intel.
And this part of the document, it's focusing on peacetime and wartime intel by what they call special organs. It specifically leaves out battlefield intel from combat units. Why that distinction?
Yeah, that's important. It's zeroing in on the work of those dedicated intel units, the ones operating away from the front lines. Think military attachés and embassies, specialist intel officers, their networks, battlefield intel, what troops see on the ground. That's different needs, different challenges. This document separates out the more systemic, long-term intel gathering.
So what were these special organs trying to find out? What were the main objectives in Anatomy of the Heart?
It's a pretty comprehensive list, actually. Shows you how broad their thinking was. Unsurprisingly, military strength is front and center.
Like troop numbers, gear?
Right. Numbers, organization, equipment, supplies, how they replenish things, their military production capacity, all that.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Gotta know what they have. What else?
Deployment and capabilities. Where are their units, their fortresses? How are they organized? But also, crucially, the quality of those units.
Not just quantity.
Exactly. And even the character and skills of senior commanders. They knew leadership mattered just as much as, say, the number of tanks.
Getting a bead on the people in charge, that's insightful.
Definitely. Beyond that, military trends like what are their main command doctrines, their tactics, what are the quirks of how they fight. Geography and logistics, too. Terrain, maps, transport networks, communication systems, how much stuff they can move around.
Vital stuff.
And, the big one if possible, strategic intentions. What are their war plans? Mobilization plans.
Okay, so the classic military intel targets are there. But it sounds like it went broader than just the military.
Oh, yeah, definitely. They understood that modern war wasn't just army versus army. It involved the whole nation.
Right.
So intel objectives expanded, things like the general national character, prevailing trends of thought, how's their domestic government run, finances, economic conditions, how are their military industries organized, even social problems.
Wow. National character and social problems. That seems really holistic for 1928, almost like modern national power assessments.
It really does. It's not just counting ships. It's trying to understand the whole organism, like you said.
Well.
And finally, international relations, especially what's going on with neighboring countries, because that obviously affects things.
So gathering all this info is one thing, but the document also talks about how the intel organizations themselves should work, right?
Absolutely. It hammers this point home. You need a good structure, clear guidance, people who are enthusiastic, proactive. Smooth communication is vital.
Okay.
It even talks about needing spiritual fusion among the different intel bodies.
Spiritual fusion, what does that imply?
It suggests something deeper than just, following procedures. A shared purpose, strong cohesion, almost like a shared ideology driving the mission. A motivated, tight-knit community.
That's a powerful phrase.
It is, and it connects intelligence, propaganda, and security. They're all linked. Good intel feeds good propaganda and security. Success in those areas helps you get more intel. They argued you have to study them together.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. It mentions propaganda being especially effective in places with incomplete political and social structures. That sounds like targeting weaknesses.
It's a sharp observation.
Yeah.
Yeah, recognizing that unstable societies are, easier to influence. But it also warns, don't let your own propaganda efforts cloud your intelligence judgment.
Right, don't start believing your own spin.
Exactly. Keep the intel objective. And on that note, it stresses using multiple sources. Never rely on just one report.
Triangulation again.
Use different methods at the same time. Cross-check, support each other, build a more solid picture.
And how did these specialized intel units work with the guys gathering info on the front lines?
They were meant to complement each other. Both streams of information contribute to the bigger picture, but since they often operate separately, the Central Intel Command had to coordinate them, make sure everyone's seeing the same overall situation.
Coordination seems like a running theme.
Very much so. It explicitly calls for interagency cooperation, working with the Navy, Foreign Affairs, Finance, other government bodies, even civilian groups. Essential for the full picture. Nobody has all the pieces.
The document also flags certain regions for extra attention.
Yeah, places with lots of political or economic competition, hotspots. There, you need to watch everyone extra closely. What are people from different countries up to? What are their intentions? Intel officers in those zones needed deep knowledge of the area, the region, all the players involved.
And what about the intel officers themselves? Any specific responsibilities beyond just gathering data?
Self-awareness was key. They needed to know their own country's situation well to provide relevant intel, and it was a two-way street. Central Command had to keep the folks abroad updated on domestic stuff and changing intel needs.
What about the classic intel dilemma? Accuracy versus speed. How do they handle that?
Acknowledge it head on. Accuracy is vital, obviously, but info that's too late is useless. So the goal is fast reporting and thorough checking. A tough balance. And they noted, way back then, that speed depends heavily on communication tech. Pretty forward-looking for 1928.
It also sounds like they knew intel wasn't a passive game.
Definitely not. They knew the enemy was doing the same thing. So you needed an offensive spirit, they called it, proactive, overcome their blocking efforts, compete with other countries also looking for secrets. It's a constant fight.
There's also a mention of ideological trends becoming more important.
Yes, and this feels very modern. They saw ideological subversion becoming like state policy, countries trying to undermine others from within. Nations with weak internal controls were seen as especially vulnerable. So intel personnel had to monitor these general thought trends, watch out for threats to national unity. It really resonates with today's worries about info ops.
It really does.
Yeah.
A century on, still relevant. And lastly, for personnel abroad, their behavior mattered.
Big time. They were representing the nation. Their conduct directly affected national prestige. So strict behavior, appropriate interactions were demanded. Even small slip-ups could damage the country's image and hurt intel ops.
Okay, that gives us a really good grasp of the general intel principles. Let's shift now to part 2, the specifics of peacetime operations. How is peacetime intel organized according to this document?
The main hub was the General Staff Headquarters. That was the core for Army intelligence in peacetime. Their intelligence department collected, analyzed info on foreign armies, national conditions, diplomacy. They also surveyed key terrain, resources, kept operational maps and materials ready, basically laying the groundwork for any future conflict.
And who reported into this central hub? What were the subordinate units?
Several key ones. You had military attachés at embassies and legations, the official intel presence within diplomatic missions.
Right.
Then resident military officers living abroad. Officers sent out specifically on intel missions, border troops, units stationed overseas, they gathered intel in their areas.
A layered approach.
Yeah, and the General Staff HQ also directly used agents and kept ties with other government and civilian intel groups. A pretty comprehensive network.
Let's focus on those military attachés. What exactly did they do?
Okay, so they were part of the diplomatic scene, expected to be experts on the military of the host country and nearby nations. Their main job was detailed reporting military matters, related issues, always monitoring global trends so Japan could react quickly, required sharp observation, good communication.
And what specific things did they have to report on?
Oh, it was broad. Military organization, training, troop locations, defenses, new tactics or strategies, new weapons or gear, terrain data, military resources, industry, transport, military finances, economics, and international affairs, especially the military angles. A very wide net.
It sounds like their focus would shift depending on where they were posted.
Exactly. The document says to tailor the focus. In potential enemy countries, priority was war preparation intel. In friendly or closely linked nations, focus on political shifts, social movements, things that could affect the relationship. In other places, maybe track military tech or just lay the groundwork for wartime intel and propaganda. Very flexible, context dependent.
With all these people operating abroad, how did they ensure everyone was working together?
Cooperation was vital. Attachés had to work closely with Japanese diplomats, consuls, other officials, civilians in the host country. Also with Japanese military folks in other countries, and even foreign military attachés there, all to get the best info. They also had to support aviation and technical personnel stationed abroad. Team effort.
You mentioned aviation and technical intel. That was handled a bit differently.
Yeah, seen as specialized fields, the Aviation HQ and Technical HQ managed that directly. They sent their own officers out to watch tech trends in host countries, colonies, neighboring areas. Shows they knew air power and tech were becoming crucial.
And what were these technical intel guys looking for?
Things like military tech systems, how those branches were organized, their equipment, weapons, especially new ones, how weapons were made, the technology behind them, military resources, particularly substitutes for scarce materials, general science and tech with military potential, inventions, patents, how military industries could mobilize, basically staying ahead of the tech curve.
What about those border units and overseas troops, their peacetime intel role?
They were the eyes and ears in their specific areas. They'd set up intel posts, use agents directly, and keep close contact with other intel units operating nearby. Forward deployed intelligence gathering.
Sounds like there could be overlap sometimes, different units covering the same ground.
Yeah, the document acknowledges that. Said specific instructions would clarify areas of responsibility, objectives, communication lines to avoid clashes. But importantly, even if an area wasn't officially yours, if you had a chance to grab intel from it, you should. Be opportunistic.
Interesting. And what about foreign military officers visiting Japan? Did they fit into this picture?
They did, interestingly. The document says invited foreign officers should, without messing up their main duties, help out Japanese intel organs. Sometimes they might even be directly involved in intel work. A way to gather info, maybe subtly influence foreign views, too.
This has been really illuminating on the peacetime setup described in Anatomy of the Heart. Paints a picture of a very complex, interconnected system, always seeking information.
It does, a methodical, forward-looking approach to understanding the world, potential adversaries, laying that crucial foundation.
Okay, we've covered a lot on intelligence. When we come back, we'll dive into the second half, propaganda and stratagem service. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're digging into Anatomy of the Heart, Japan's historical guide to intelligence and propaganda. We just covered the intelligence service part. Now let's shift to the second major section, propaganda and stratagem service. What was the main goal here?
Well, the big picture goal was basically to create favorable conditions, a good atmosphere, both inside Japan and internationally.
Oh.
By carefully choosing the right time, the right methods, especially methods that hit emotionally, to spread specific information within certain limits. It's about shaping perceptions, influencing behavior for national interests.
So propaganda, as we usually think of it. But it also mentions stratagem, or butriaku. How did they define that? How is it different?
Stratagem, as they defined it, was more about actions to directly or indirectly mess with the enemy's ability to run their war effort, to execute operations.
like sabotage.
Sort of. Using people or groups outside the regular military to cause destruction, or political, ideological, economic sabotage. Guiding or inciting that kind of activity. So propaganda shapes minds with information. Stratagem uses more direct, often covert actions to undermine the enemy's power and will.
Like supporting dissidents inside the enemy country.
Exactly. That could be a stratagem creating internal chaos.
So it's like psych warfare combined with more tangible disruption. And the document saw both propaganda and stratagem as key parts of national power.
Absolutely. Argued that winning wars isn't just about military force. A nation's political, economic, ideological strength is critical too. Propaganda and stratagem were tools to target those foundations. Instruments of war in peacetime, preparing the ground, and during wartime itself. Indispensable tools.
Given how important they saw them, they stressed a unified approach.
Yeah. Clear principles, unwavering commitment needed. So planning and execution should be handled by one national organization. And crucially, they said effective wartime propaganda and stratagem are really hard. Unless you've built the infrastructure and done the prep work during peacetime, consistency, clear ideology right down to the lowest levels were vital.
And just like with intel, they knew this wasn't a one-way street.
Right. Just like intel faces counter-intel, propaganda faces counter-propaganda. Stratagems face countermeasures. They called it a great struggle without form or sound. Far-reaching, subtle, but significant impact. Needs just as much organizational effort.
The document then gets into the psychology, manipulating public feeling.
Yes, manipulating mass psychology was core to both. Planning had to be meticulous, organizations tight, operations tuned to public opinion. Adaptable, different times, places, audiences needed different approaches, conventional or unconventional.
And thorough research on the target country was essential.
Non-negotiable. You had to deeply understand their internal situation to run effective propaganda or stratagems. Shows again how closely linked this was to intelligence. You needed intel to figure out the best timing, methods, channels, targets for your influence ops. Then you make detailed plans based on that intel.
How did propaganda and stratagem relate to each other in practice?
Very closely. Synergistic. Working in parallel for the same goals, but also supporting and boosting each other. So planning and execution had to be tightly coordinated, smooth, reinforcing.
What about wartime propaganda and stratagem specifically? Any special consideration?
Had to be closely tied to how the military operations were going. Dynamic link. Constant communication with the front was essential. Timing, method, scope had to align with the military situation. Especially stuff happening near the battlefield needed total coordination with the army there.
The people involved were also seen as critical.
Hugely. Because you're dealing with human psychology, fluid situations, the abilities of the personnel in charge at every level were key. So, careful selection, thorough training starting in peacetime were essential.
With propaganda spreading information, did that ever clash with, say, internal censorship?
Good point. They acknowledged that potential clash. Propaganda disseminates counter-intel censors. So they stressed close liaison, coordinated systems between the two, make sure they don't accidentally trip each other up.
And finally, before getting into specific methods, it points back to the intel section for things like communication behavior.
Correct. The principles from the intel section, communication rules, operative conduct, self-defense, applied here too. But it added a warning. People in propaganda, and especially stratagem, should expect even greater personal risk than pure intel gatherers, given the more provocative nature of their work.
Sounds like high-stakes work, definitely. Okay, let's get into propaganda specifics. What general principles did Anatomy of the Heart lay out?
The main thing was choosing everything appropriately. The audience, the scope of the message, the timing, the materials, the delivery method, all based on the situation. Flexibility and adaptability were absolutely key.
It also talks about focusing on the most sensitive points for the audience.
Yes. The overall campaign goals set the strategy, but the core message should hit where it hurts most, where it's likely to have a quick, powerful impact. But propaganda aimed at secondary audiences could also be useful, supporting the main effort, creating a wider effect.
And if you're using multiple propaganda channels at once?
Strong coordination needed. They have to be interconnected, support each other, be consistent in messaging as much as possible, avoid contradictions, don't undermine each other. A fragmented approach just weakens the impact.
What if you have lots of different audiences for the same basic goal?
The document suggests that hitting everyone at once might spread you too thin, dilute the impact. Might be better to target areas sequentially, especially if you find a real vulnerability in one group. Strategic focus was crucial.
Timing keeps coming up for intel and propaganda.
Definitely. Untimely propaganda loses its punch. They stressed picking the moment carefully, making sure the theme, method, channel all fit that timing perfectly to maximize the effect.
Sounds like hitting people when they're down was a key tactic.
Pretty much. Propaganda works best not when people are calm and rational, but when they're doubting, emotional, anxious, exploiting psychological instability. The best time for anti-enemy propaganda, when things are going badly for them and their public opinion is already shaky. Coordinate propaganda with military actions to make things worse for them, hurt morale, exploit unrest.
Surprise is also important.
Yeah, propaganda that catches people off guard hits harder initially. So when choosing materials, methods, timing, channels, targets always think about surprise. Make it harder for them to counter effectively.
It warns against propaganda that feels temporary or unreliable.
Exactly. If it seems flimsy or untrustworthy, it has limited effect, might even backfire, gives the enemy ammo. So repeat core messages consistently towards a specific goal over time. Until the audience starts to internalize it, believe it. Repetition builds belief.
Abstract or indirect propaganda wasn't seen as very effective either.
Right. If it doesn't connect directly to people's immediate interests, their lives, it's weak, easily ignored. Focus on concrete facts that clearly impact the audience's well-being. That creates powerful resonance.
Really highlights that understanding the audience's psychology is everything.
Totally. You have to constantly watch how they're reacting, be ready to adapt, update materials and methods, make sure it's landing. The ultimate goal, for them to absorb the message almost without thinking, make it part of their worldview.
The document also says propaganda should generally be proactive, on the offensive.
Yes, generally take the initiative, shape the narrative. But it also noted the value of turning the enemy's own propaganda against them. Strategic jujitsu. If you do that, though, you need to be assertive. Make sure your counter message really overwhelms their original one.
What about truth and propaganda, according to this?
This is a really interesting bit. It says the most effective propaganda conveys the truth. But then comes the big but. Even if the facts aren't entirely accurate, propaganda only works if the audience believes it's true.
Believability over strict accuracy.
That seems to be the focus. Consistency, avoiding contradictions are key. If the enemy dismisses it as obvious lies or just propaganda, it's failed. It could even be harmful.
So the main goal was persuasion, achieving the effect, maybe regardless of facts.
The emphasis is definitely on the outcome influencing beliefs and actions. The stress on believability, even if facts are fudged, strongly suggests that interpretation of their thinking.
Lastly, it mentions the value of backing up propaganda with real-world actions.
Yes. Propaganda hits hardest when reinforced by actual events that match the message. Tangible proof makes it more direct, impactful, credible, lends it weight.
This has been a really deep look into their thinking on propaganda and stratagem service. Clearly, they saw it as a sophisticated, vital part of national power.
Indeed, a highly strategic, methodical approach to shaping minds and influencing actions, both before and during conflict.
We'll be right back with our final thoughts on this deep dive into Anatomy of the Heart. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our deep dive into Anatomy of the Heart. We've looked at the Japanese military's thinking on intelligence, propaganda, stratagem. Looking back, what are the main things that stand out to you?
Well, for me, it's just how systematic and comprehensive it all is. They weren't just thinking about isolated spying missions or dropping a few leaflets. It was a fully integrated doctrine, explicitly linking intel, propaganda, even wider national policy.
Right.
And that basic idea, deeply understanding your adversary, their military, society, psychology, as the foundation for everything else, it still feels incredibly relevant today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the sheer power they saw in information, both for understanding and for influencing, is striking for that time. The way they categorized different intel methods planned for peace versus war, it shows a really sophisticated grasp of the field.
And on the propaganda side, tailoring the message, exploiting vulnerabilities, understanding psychological triggers, those principles are still totally relevant in today's, crazy information environment. The tools have changed dramatically, obviously, but the core ideas about persuasion, surprisingly consistent.
It's also interesting seeing the built-in tensions, like you mentioned earlier. Accuracy versus speed in intel, being proactive versus reactive in propaganda. It shows these aren't simple fields.
Exactly. This wasn't a simple checklist. It needed judgment, adaptability, like the document itself says, by stressing the operative skill, initiative, even commitment. That spiritual fusion idea really points to the human element being central.
This look into anatomy of the heart definitely shows a really detailed, systematic approach to what we now call information warfare. It's a fascinating historical window onto these enduring principles, gathering information, shaping perceptions. So what does this tell you, listening now, about these ideas, regardless of the era or the tech? This deep dive offers a pretty unique way to think about national power and strategy across time.
It certainly makes you think about how these historical methods might shed light on, the information challenges we face right now.
Indeed. If you found this dive into anatomy of the heart thought-provoking, we hope you'll consider its echoes today and maybe explore more on the history of intelligence and propaganda. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.